The erosion of teachers' authority is not an issue unique to South Korea, but the country's approach to its food waste appears to be just that. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective for August 12th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. The Gyeonggi Provincial Office for Education has selected 300 dedicated teacher protection officers, the first initiative of its kind here in South Korea. The selection itself comes as the issue of protecting teachers' rights recently became a hot topic in the country, partly due to the Netflix K-drama Teach You a Lesson. For more on this, I have Celio Fioretti with French daily Le Croix here in the studio. Celio, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI with us. Thomas, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Celio, let's start with you. Let's begin with details about the role of these newly appointed officers.
Indeed. So according to reports, the Gyeonggi Office of Education is setting up what it calls a teacher rights protection officers, a new system designed to support teachers from the very moment a malicious complaint is filed until the case is finally resolved. Once selected, these officers will be paired one-on-one with teachers who are facing serious rights violation or threat, malicious complaints, for example. They won't work alone either. They will be backed by a team of lawyers, doctors, education supervisors, and counseling experts to really have a broad team to cover all aspects of it. Their responsibility is also quite broad. They will handle initial counseling and on-site response when an incident happens in the school, for example, but also conduct fact-finding investigation, provide legal advice to the teachers, and offer also psychological care for them, and also manage the follow-up support after the case is resolved. Essentially, the goal is that no teacher has to navigate a complex situation alone. They can rely on a team that is made for that. They're expert in that. To change the way that they often did until now. It's worth noting that this new office was indeed inspired by this drama about school bullying, and also it portrays this team going to schools and fixing the problems. In the show, they might use some sort of violence, which is also why people kind of liked it, because it feels very cathartic to see a bully get beaten. The real officers will not use violence, of course. They will use a legal way to fix the problem. As for scale, also, the reports usually actually reports the initial recruitment is around 50 positions. So although over I think 1,800 people applied for the job, so there was really a lot of demand, and the office has to push officer expanding maybe more position in the future if the project goes well.
Right, indeed. Staying with what Celio just said, Thomas, the application procedure itself, it was quite competitive. There were 36 applicants, I believe, for every opening. The applicants included lawyers as well as former police officers. What do you suppose are the broader implications of this level of public interest?
Well, I think clearly, this topic has touched a nerve in the society, and I think it's the reason, one of the main reasons that the show is so popular in the first place is that it's really addressing something that people have been feeling here, or maybe have experienced it themselves, or their children are experiencing it, and this topic has been kind of a major issue, I would say, for not just only with this show. It's been going on at least for a few years. We were talking before the show about, there was the, which I think they do address within the Teach You a Lesson, one of the episodes, teacher who died by suicide, a real life case, and they kind of fictionalized in the show. But that was a major story in 2023, I believe, and that spurred, tens of thousands of teachers to go on strike, and that got really major media attention. So, and there was the series The Glory in 2023 also kind of touched on school bullying, even something like Old Boy, the film goes back to kind of traces some of it back to school. So I think it's been a topic that has been very much in the public eye in the recent years, and it definitely sort of generates an emotional response. You know, and I think sort of just generally in South Korea sometimes you see these, you know, I've sort of noticed, it's been interesting, I'm trying to figure out where, you know, sort of the lines between these things, because there is a kind of, there are like hierarchical structures in a lot of, you know, social places, work, family life, school, you know, gender inequality, things like that. And, you know, sometimes this sense of impunity among the powerful and the business elite. But at the same time, you know, the public seems to be really sensitive to stories of abuses of power. It kind of breaks containment, and it really, you know, lands so strongly within the culture. And I think education-related stories especially really seem to resonate. You know, I was remembering Park Geun-hye, the former president, you know, the whole series of scandals that ended in her impeachment kind of started with her sort of, you know, mentor or advisor, Choi Soon-sil, when her daughter was found to have gotten into Ewha University, you know, with sort of inside connections, and that sort of sparked the outrage that led to this whole, you know, kind of snowballing. And you know, there's been many other stories of people using their, you know, power to get their children into school. So there's some, you know, education is so important here, and it's so, you know, it's such a competitive field that, you know, on the one hand, it also generates the kind of bad behavior of maybe parents abusing teachers to try and get their kids' grades up. So, you know, you can see both sides of it, but it's just, yeah, it's such a charged emotional thing, and it does affect a lot of people's lives. So I guess I can see why people would be responding to it. You know, at the same time, there is this sort of feel-good vengeance angle to the show that, you know, is going to be harder to replicate in real life. I mean, there's not really these easy answers to these types of problems. And, you know, of course, you also don't want people to think, oh, I'm going in and, you know, going to be a vigilante or sort of take matters into my own hands. So hopefully it doesn't turn into that. But, you know, yeah, clearly the response signals how meaningful this idea is to the country.
Thomas, for the sake of comparison, what can you tell us about the systems in place over in the US to protect teachers and their rights within the academic arena?
Yeah, so, you know, I think it's been something that has been addressed for maybe a longer period of time, and, you know, it takes many different forms. I mean, one of the things with the US that's hard to kind of compare is that every state is different. Every state has its own, you know, basically is in control of its own educational system. So it really can vary a lot state by state, the systems. You know, I mean, there are some federal laws that protect teachers and principals from liability, kind of, you know, when it comes to things like classroom discipline, and there's constitutional protections for your job. But, you know, on a state-to-state level, I mean, one thing that's really emerged more recently are these like school threat assessment teams, they're called. And I think around 11 states now have some mandated form of that. And this is much more about kind of a proactive, trying to detect threats ahead of time. And, you know, a lot of that comes very unfortunately from the level of, you know, school violence that has been, you know, ongoing in the US, especially in the last few decades. I mean, especially gun violence and school shootings, which, you know, thankfully is not anything, you know, on the same level here. But so there's been this need to kind of try and get systems together to catch things ahead of time, proactively sort of evaluate behavior, determine what's a real threat versus, and so there are, you know, there's a more of, you know, as Celio mentioned, I think this idea in Gyeonggi is to kind of have this multidisciplinary approach, and those sorts of things do exist in these threat assessment teams where they're kind of administrators, there's counselors and psychologists, social workers, there are law enforcement liaisons, you know, legal and compliance officers. I mean, a lot of schools do have police on hand already, you know, which is something that's also can be sort of alarming at the same time as you know, maybe keeping things safe. So, you know, there's also sort of state anti-bullying laws. There are, you know, and some also state by state. I mean, some states have very strong teacher unions, some don't. So some teachers can be protected by unions. And so, you know, some of these threat assessment things are also kind of incorporate threats to teachers, you know, within that framework. So there's more there, and it's been going on for a longer time. But, you know, the U.S. still has quite a large bullying problem and, you know, school violence problem. So it's, you know, not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, it's really not easy.
Yeah.
From the US over to France and Celio, I understand teachers over in France are regarded as public officials. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, indeed. So in France, as opposed to maybe Korea, in the perception at least, French teachers are civil servants, fonctionnaires in French, and they're even colloquially nicknamed sometimes the hussars of the Republic. So the hussars were some cavalry soldiers from way back in time, and that nickname really captured that they are the Republic, the state's frontline soldiers, there to train and shape the future citizens. So that status means attacking a teacher, insulting them, is a direct attack to the states, almost. So French teachers enjoy quite a good job security and a solid institution behind them to back them, with a centralized Ministry of Education, as we say, like different from the US, which is state by state. There's a more solid institution to back them up, to also structure the whole education. Korea tradition is quite different. I would say the teaching draws more on the Confucian tradition. So historically, teachers have been quite of a moral figure, a moral authority, commanding enormous social respect, and it's still, in Korea, it's still a fiercely competitive job to get, a competitive position to get. But that respect, and back in the days, especially in Korea, you didn't want to mess with a teacher because they could punish you quite strongly. But that respect kind of changed with also how the society changed, because now the education is much more competitive because much more people try to go to universities, and that creates a lot of pressure on families, in schools, on children, and we see that the more and more demanding parents, maybe exam-obsessed parents, are pushing a bit too much on their kids, but also on the teachers, and that leads to a lot of problems. So we can see maybe the prestige or the perception of the teachers is quite eroding, it's shifting a bit. But interestingly, in France, the flip side of this maybe strong institutional protection, despite this protected status among the OECD country, French teachers are the one they say they feel the less, they feel more undervalued by society in their works somehow. But the difference, I would say, between France and Korea is like France maybe has a lot of legal protection for teachers. Korea has not, but as we said just earlier in the show, this new office by the Gyeonggi Office of Education might maybe try to fill the gap into a quite highly prestigious job, but lacking legal protection.
Thomas, amid these efforts to protect rights within the academic arena, there have been some who voiced concerns about the increasing judicialization of schools. What are your thoughts?
Right, so, I think this kind of, like a lot of things I feel like we sometimes discuss on the program, some of it I feel comes along, with this kind of speed of change of things that are happening sometimes in South Korean society. And I think, just the rate that Korea has developed and some of the problems and challenges that spring up in this kind of compressed time frame, it's not easy to sort of address those, and sometimes it's kind of trying to find the balance of how to respond. So, I think this idea of the judicialization of schools, it seems like it sparked with, I think it was starting with just the 2026 college admissions, or, there was a change in the law to require records of school violence to be considered in admissions processes in South Korea, and this was only, something new. So then that has really sparked this whole process around that, which, some of it just gets into, the teachers and the school administrations having to kind of do all this paperwork, and just kind of figure out, when is it okay to sort of resolve things informally versus create this paper trail and create kind of a, quasi-legal framework around it, and are you harming, these are some of the debates, are you harming a kid for one thing they did a few years ago, but at the same time, obviously it's in response to these levels of bullying that we've seen and, again, against both students and teachers. So it's really, I think, this idea of, how to strike a balance, especially when it's in this kind of the speed sometimes that things happen, here in Korea. I mean, in the world, it's happening too, at a high pace, but I often feel like Korea is like this hyper-accelerated version of addressing some of these social problems. So it is kind of a social recalibration and trying to figure out, what's the authority that the teacher should have, what rights do students and parents have, what boundaries are appropriate, how the conflict should be resolved. And, in this case, you're sort of bringing an administrative and almost a bureaucratic procedure into it so that can create friction, questions, tensions. So it's something that I think it's responding to a very real need, and clearly I think there's something that I think the idea that students have gotten away perhaps with especially if they were well connected, as we've seen in that series, have gotten away with abuses. So I think it's responding to something very real, but I think trying to find the way to calibrate it still is can be a challenge.
It's going to be a daunting task, of course.
Yeah.
Thomas, let's move away from the classroom into the kitchen. The US media, it's been highlighting South Korea's approach to food waste. Before we delve into this, first tell us, how is food waste generally handled over in the US?
Again, I turn back to this kind of federalized version where it really varies, by state, even locally. I mean, in general, though, food waste is not nearly as well, controlled or recycled as here in Korea, where I guess it's 98% recycled here in Korea, whereas in the U.S., that something about 60% of food waste goes to landfills, and it accounts for, differing percentages, but something from 24 to 30% of all landfill space in the U.S. is food. And so, it's sort of this patchwork thing. I mean, there's there's clearly an attempt to address it. The U.S. in 2015 set a goal to cut waste in half by 2030, but from most accounts I've seen, it's really barely moved the number at all. There's not really a federal requirement for something like separating food waste like they have here, and there's not really a nation like here. They have a pay-as-you-throw system, paying to dispose, and some municipalities and states have it in the U.S., but not nationwide. So it's kind of this patchwork where some places are very strongly leaning into something like composting, like especially places like San Francisco, Seattle. And then, there are other measures, but I think the thing there, some of the responses that have been the U.S. is sort of experimenting with are kind of trying to move farther up the supply chain, not just household waste, but working more to use anaerobic digestion to make biogas, and sort of even things like AI-based food waste tracking, and just sort of inventory control. Like there's a lot of waste that even goes into that, and literally being better about labeling dates on food so people don't necessarily throw things away. I mean, there's been discussion of reducing portion sizes, things on a personal level. This coincides with just the rising cost of food prices in the U.S., and issues like hunger and homeless, or for under sort of privileged members of the community. So I think there is an incentive to try and address this on a kind of maybe more holistic way, not just recycling, but what do you do with the food that's already out there, and sort of finding systems to track it. But again, it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all national solution.
Right, for sure. In the meantime, though, Celio, the French media also covered South Korea's approach to its food waste. Why do you suppose is South Korea's system garnering so much international attention?
Well, indeed, a lot of my colleagues, myself included, covered that recycling policy. The country, as Thomas said, recycled around like 95–98% of its food waste, which is a stunning number, especially when we compare it. It's not only the US, but like in most of the countries in the world, around 40–60% of food waste end up in landfills. So Korea is really unique and performs super well compared to the others. And the core of the system, Thomas mentioned, is the pay-as-you-throw principle. Since early 2010, Korean households have been allowed to just haven't been allowed, to just toss your food in the bin, in regular trash bin also. Instead they have to use special biodegradable yellow bags, or in many also apartment complexes in Seoul and other cities, you have RFID enabled bins that weigh your food waste and charge you based on the volume. So there's essentially the more food waste you throw away, the more you have to pay, which is a direct incentive to people to throw away less food. And once collected, that food waste is not just simply discarded either. I visited some plants where they collect the food and through a really high-tech process, they dry it and they compress into small tiny bit, which becomes animal fodder, for example, or just thing that you can fertilizer, for example, for crops. So it's also redistributed and reused, really recycled well, and that's also it's not only for environment, but also people can, there's a whole economy behind it because farmers can buy it, can buy fertilizer or animal fodder for a cheaper price. It's all benefiting the economy, but also the environment. And what is really fascinating for foreign observers, I would say, is that the scale and the consistency of it. It's a policy that was decided maybe 1 or 2 decades ago and put in place really rapidly and working efficiently. So it's something that we don't often see, especially with policies about food waste or every environmental policy. It's really hard to bring some change, but it seems Korea managed to do it and do it well.
Right, and this being said then, Thomas, do you suppose the Korean system could be adopted in the US?
I think it would be really tough, to have something that is this comprehensive and well integrated. I mean, just there's many. Again, it's hard to sort of do nationwide sort of initiatives like that, and just kind of the layout of the country and the democracy. Here in Korea, it's a lot of these, as Celio was mentioning, a lot of these apartment complexes have these machines that built right into them, and the U.S. is just so many different types of homes, and the coordination is really tough. So I think it's not to say you can't get some better results, but I think it will have to be more of a kind of a patchwork local approach. But I think the incentive is growing to find some solutions.
Right. Celio, France actually introduced the mandatory separation of food waste back in the year 2024. What has been the result thus far and the public response?
Well, the public really expected some big change because, as you said, in 2024, from January 1st, 2024, actually, France required every household and businesses to separate food and garden waste into, in similar spirit of Korea's policy, into separate bins. But the results so far has been quite mixed, mainly because a key difference is, unlike Korea, French law doesn't actually punish non-compliance. So the obligation falls on local government, local municipalities to provide a sorting solution, not on individual household to use it. And there's currently no fines if you don't follow the rules. That's also combined to a slow rollout of the policy. France Environment Agency says only around 40% of bins have been deployed, because again, it falls on local government, municipalities to find the money to install those bins. And that didn't work that well because the government green fund that was supposed to help those environmental policies has been cut by 20% last year. So it really slowed down even more the implementation of that policy. Even though the public response was actually quite good, the feedback was fairly positive. People expected maybe a better handling of food waste. They were not so against the idea of sorting their food and doing a little bit of more effort for the planet. But in the end, even though people wanted something, the government failed to deliver on their promise.
All right, I see. I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Celio, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.